Thank you. All right. Erin, if you would make your way up, please. So I'm going to make an exception to the principle I applied yesterday, and I am going to read a few things from Erin's background because, yes, please. So Erin Bow is a science writer, storyteller. She's the author of 3 volumes of poetry. She has 6 novels in print, one of which you can get a copy of during the break with her signature. She has won a Newbery Honor. She's longlisted for a National Book Award. In the corporate world, she's been a storyteller attached to Generation Energy, which was the Canadian government's effort to reimagine power generation. She's opened for Margaret Atwood, which I imagine in the literary world is sort of equivalent to opening for...
Yeah, it's like when you go to the concert and you want to see the big band, but then there's the little band that you just want to throw things at. But
no, not at all. No.
Poetry audiences don't bring things to throw.
Anyway, and then she's currently working on a project with the Amelia Earhart estate to focus on Amelia's work as a feminist. This comment here, to a generation that knows her only as a vanished pilot. You know, I find this so often, just meeting people who are like under 30, who we just have a completely different frame of reference on cultural things and historical events, and it's always, so thank you for doing that.
Absolutely.
All right, really looking forward to your talk this morning.
We're gonna try up, but we have a down option. And I'll put my notes down and pick up my thing. Good morning, I'm your wild card. So, as your wild card, let's go time traveling. Okay, we're going to go with all of space and time to choose from, and if anyone has the Doctor Who music cleared up, please let me know. To March of 1979. We'll stay here in Baltimore. It's kind of a dismal choice, actually. First of all, it's 40 degrees and sleeting, and there's quite a bit of mud. Spring has come late here. The whole country's learning to spell the word malaise. Energy prices are high, crime is high, unemployment is high. But heck, let's go to the movies, right? Let's see what's new. Here's one. A moderately compelling thriller. It's Thursday, right? That'll do. It's another one of these disaster films, but let's just say it's no towering inferno. But anyway. Part of the problem, this movie opened 2 weeks ago, and it's doing, yeah. And part of the problem is maybe the title, which is an extremely obscure piece of industry jargon. In fact, Columbia Pictures, the producers, have just put out ads in today's paper, March 28th, trying to make a virtue of the fact that the title makes no sense to anyone. So, it's March 28th. 1979. We're going to go to the movies, but just before dawn, less than 100 miles from here, one power valve has failed at the 3 Mile Island nuclear power plant in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. In this moment, the fiction and the fact snap together to create story. The extent to which these become conflated is quite incredible. Right? This is a slow-moving disaster. It takes about 3 days to unfold, maybe 5 days to resolve completely before the president visits the site and everyone kind of calms down. The plant officials are like, folks, this is not a China syndrome type situation, but the news organizations, desperate to explain what's going on in a complex world, start running clips from the movie over and over again, and in particular, the clip where the scientist explains what a meltdown is and why it's called the China syndrome, how it's going to melt through the bottom of the plant and then hit the groundwater. The number of people killed will depend on which way the wind is blowing. It will render an area the size of Pennsylvania permanently uninhabitable. The 3 Mile Island plant, if you don't know, is in Pennsylvania. Just a coincidence. But this becomes, for better or worse, the way nuclear power is understood for decades to come. What are the risks of nuclear power generation? Well, I mean, I think we probably have experts in the room, and they're going to tell us those are complex, right? It's worth noting that the 3 Mile Island incident is by far the most serious incident ever suffered by an American nuclear power generating plant. It is a meltdown. They sent in a camera later and discovered that the core had melted to the bottom of the plant. The reactor was destroyed. But the release of radiation into the environment was extremely minimal. They did long-term health studies, and although these things are hard to tease out, as far as we can tell, there's no impact on human health or on the environment. But what are the risks of nuclear power? We're going to look at them through the lens of the story that nature has picked for us. The risk of nuclear power is that we're going to render the area the size of Pennsylvania permanently uninhabitable. That would include us, by the way. It's less than 100 miles from here. And, you know, maybe DC too, right? What are the benefits of nuclear power? Well, if you look at it through this lens, it seems foolish even to ask, right? It seems curlish, and why would you even ask what the benefits are when the risks are so extreme? Right? The story of nuclear power, the story of how the 3 Mile Island incident and the China syndrome interacts with it is complicated. I am simplifying it. But what I want to say this morning is that we need stories about science. And so scientists need to learn to tell stories. Right? I know this is uphill. Scientists are not naturally trained to tell stories, and why would they be, right? We don't include this, and by scientists I mean, I'm going to speak broadly and include people with technical expertise, engineers, doctors, I think probably everyone in this room, but science for short. It's a complex technological world. We need to make big decisions as societies about things that we as individuals don't have a full grasp on. We need governance about AI. We need governance about CRISPR and gene editing technology. We need to take action urgently on climate change. We need to convince people that vaccines are safe, that genetically modified food is not going to turn you into Frankenstein's monster. We need these stories. And if scientists don't tell these stories, either we'll be overtaken by events, as happened with the nuclear power industry, or someone else will tell them for us. And those people might not be informed, and they might not even be well-intentioned. There are plenty of examples in history. Like anything else that has a lot of power, stories can be weaponized. And stories about science are particularly vulnerable to this because really, if you don't care very much about your integrity, you can make the facts seem to mean just about anything. Some of us may remember a book called The Bell Curve, which came out in the 90s, I think, and put a scientific top dressing on racism, right? It's the 80s, it's the 80s, yeah. But by the time it made it into the university systems and into the school systems, it's like, you know what? Maybe black people aren't performing well in schools because, we checked with their IQ, we looked, and they're just naturally not smart. Now, one could ask oneself, is this possibly a problem with the IQ test? Revealing systemic bias on the part of, the entire culture and the way the test is put together. Probably. On the other hand, maybe they're just not smart, right? And this was the point of this book. Science stories can be weaponized. So we need good stories about science. And therefore, we need, as scientists and as technical experts, to get better at telling stories. So if I stopped right here and convinced you of this, I would be super happy. But I've got two things I kind of wanted to do today. First, explain exactly what the advantages of storytelling are, and secondly, give you a little bit of nitty-gritty on how to tell them. All right. And if anybody wants me to skip to the nitty-gritty part, please let me know. But there are basically 3 ways in which stories are more powerful than presenting sets of facts. The first is that they really add value, and they do this in a really measurable way. In 2009, there was a journalist named, Rob Walker. And this is a stunt, but it's an illustrative one. He founded a thing called the Significant Objects Program. He went and he bought 200 objects off of eBay, paying a total of about $300. They're cheap. These fish spoons are one of them. They're on the expensive side. He paid $3 for this set of fish spoons. Then he approached 200 poets and novelists and storytellers and said, would you write me a story and turn this into a significant object? And people did. This set of fish stones is connected to a story from the American poet Mark Dottie, who talks about, when I was in high school, I stumbled into the library. You could never find what you needed, but sometimes if you reached up onto the shelf, you'd find something magical in the way of books, in this cluttered library that no one was looking after. And I found something. I found an Anglo-Saxon book of riddles. And the one that's really stuck with me is the one about what moves in the darkness with chainmail that makes no sound, right? And the answer is a fish. Talks about chainmail made of mercury. No, wait, no, that can't be right. Anglo-Saxons, did they have mercury? Maybe, maybe not. But this poem has always stuck with me, this sense of something moving in the darkness and being unconcerned about the dark, which doesn't entirely explain why I stole these fish spoons. But I was at this flea market one day, and she was looking the other way, and I just put my hand down on, and then we repost all these objects on eBay, right? The stories that are attached to the objects now are clearly tagged as fiction. No one is being deceived. These $3 fish spoons sold for 76 bucks. The $200 worth of junk, and you can go to the Significant Objects page and read the stories and see the junk. It's really quite incredible. There's a little sand animal attached to a story about Michael Jackson staging a fake bar mitzvah that sold for several $100s. It's really quite an incredible set of stuff. I urge you to go check it out when you're having a dull afternoon. Anyway, $300 worth of junk, slightly more than $8,000 worth of profit. Stories add value. Stories also stick, by which I mean they're more memorable. Right? Say I gave you a list of 6 random things. This is, by the way, the person, man, woman, camera, TV test, if you're ever wondering where that came from. Say I gave you a list of 5 random things. I'm like, okay, we got an iPhone, a carnation, a chemist, an infant baby, and a coffee carafe. All right. 10 minutes later, I'm going to ask you to recite that. Please don't write them down. Just keep them in your head. Can you do it 10 minutes later? Can you do it half an hour later? Can you repeat them? No. It's only 5 objects, Mercedes. Could you do it tomorrow? What if I gave you the list that went Mama bear, Papa bear, baby bear, the chair, the bed, the porridge? Done, right? If you grew up with the Western fairy tales, you know that you can attach these to Goldilocks and the 3 Bears. Could you do that tomorrow? Could you do that 5 years from now? Stories help people retain information. In fact, people who memorize things competitively, which is a thing that people do, either tell stories or set things to music in their head. This is how they're done. So if you need to remember 5 random words, the best way to do it is to construct them as a narrative, even if the narrative is nonsense. The monkey drives the tricycle up the stair, whatever, right? This gives you 22 times better information retention. Not 22%, 22 times. It goes from about 5% to about 65%. The most important thing to know about stories, and their advantages is that stories change minds. In fact, this is so important, I'm going to give it its own side. Facts don't change minds, but stories do. This is bad news, guys. I'm sorry. As someone who is trained as a scientist, as someone who has spent a professional lifetime in science communication, I probably join everyone in the room in just deeply believing that if I could just explain things to folks, they would change their minds. I'm particularly passionate about climate change. And there are so many people, I live in Canada, and the number of times I'm here is like, global warming, I could do with a little warming. You know how cold it gets? Like, and you sit and you try to explain, and you really think that that's going to change someone's mind. But it just doesn't. This is well studied. All right? This is not just me asserting it from my years of professional experience. This is well studied as a phenomenon, and it's particularly true. What we do is we use stories to anchor ourselves into our identities, into our social group, into our understanding of the world, into our understanding of ourselves. If we're presented with facts that challenge one of these stories, we hold on to that anchor harder. We dig in our heels and we become more firmly entrenched in the counterfactual that we believe. Honestly, if you talk to folks who are opposed to childhood vaccination and you give them the stats on the actual injury count of childhood vaccination, they are going to give you a speech about where those stats came from and how corrupt they are and how big whatchamacallit is suppressing the truth. The facts will not change their minds. A story might. And there are various kinds of strategies for what kind of story, who to connect to. You're more likely to change people's minds if they already agree with you on most points. So your most effective communication is sort of one row over, not 10 rows over, to meet people where they are, to use emotion to lead it. There are various ways in which particular stories change minds, but just know that facts unfortunately don't. And I wish this were not true, but it is. So, what we really need, I'm sorry, Ike.
Do journalists know what you just said?
Yes. Yes, so this is called the information deficit model of communication. And it's studied as a model. Of course, journalists' job is to report the facts. But occasionally, you will get a journalist who understands. I'm thinking in particular of Ed Yong, who's a science journalist who worked with The Atlantic during the pandemic. Well, he's worked on many things, and he writes brilliant science nonfiction books on a variety of topics. But he was in the trenches talking about the pandemic, and he made a point of talking not simply to experts, but to patients and nurses and people on the ground, and beginning his reporting and lacing it throughout with stories. So yes, there are journalists who do this, but if you've got 500 words and your job is who, what, when, where, why, I get it. But it is hard, So. And it can be subtle too. Sometimes you're being fed a story, and you think you're being fed facts. So there are people who know that very well too, like our friends from the bell curve. You think you're being fed facts, but you're actually being fed a narrative. So why do stories work so well? Stories work so well because they're hardwired. As far as one can tell, and this is a difficult thing to tease out of prehistory, and a lot of evolutionary psychology stories end up being just so stories that just, confirm what you want to know already. But as far as we can tease out of prehistory, we've been telling stories about as long as we've been behaviorally modern human beings, which is to say about 100,000 years, maybe 10%, 15% longer than that. Not quite sure. Storytelling may be what made us into behaviorally modern human beings. It may be what took us from something that has our physical form but does not behave anything like us. And there was a transition at some point. So this is why the phrase behaviorally modern. There was a transition from a creature that had the body and the brain structure of a Homo sapien but did not behave like us to a creature that is behaviorally modern. And we think that transition has to do with art and storytelling. It may have something to do with flint napping because those two areas happen to be wired very closely together in the brain. If you start to nap flint and plan where your next strike is going to be, you are engaging kind of your narrative mind. So they may be connected together, but it's basically the killer app for the human mind, right? It became how we transmit data, knowledge, strategy from one person to another, from one group to another, across the generations. How do we get better at things? How do we communicate with people at a distance? How do we begin to develop such complex systems that one person can't do everything? Because there was a time if you were born into a Homo sapien community, you would grow up in kind of a generalist, you would basically be able to do everything in that community that community needed to do, could be picked up by any individual. Societies begin to become more complex. We get folks who can do the flint napping and folks who know how to put up the meat for the winter. They're not necessarily the same folks, right? The society is more complex than can fit into one person's brain. Storytelling is what made that possible. We've been telling stories for at least 80,000 years longer than we've been growing crops. There was an 80,000-year period where it was somehow more important to us to tell a story than it was for us to feed ourselves. In fact, they're so primal that even today, if you have a new infant and you bring them home, you make them warm, you make them safe, you get them fed, and then you tell them a story. Right? We're hardwired to tell them, and that means we're hardwired to respond to them. And that's what makes them powerful. Unfortunately, scientists are not generically good at telling stories. Part of this is because science, I think, is an outgrowth of the Enlightenment project. Science as we understand it today in the West is an outgrowth of the Enlightenment project that began about 300 years ago. We explicitly value observation, data, objectivity, constructing these things into systems of knowledge, learning about the self in a critical way. What are we devaluing? Emotion, storytelling, anything that looks anything like religion, which includes a lot of different narrative arcs. So to push back against it, even now, if you stand up as a scientist and tell a personal story, someone is going to go, that's just anecdotal, right? Or it's like, you're letting your emotions run away with you. This is not serious. You're a scientist. I need you to be serious. I need you to look at the data. I need you to do the work. Right? And this is a kind of backlash that you will face if you stand up and you tell stories about science. This is particularly true if you're a woman in science. I will tell you from my personal experience. I imagine that it's also true for people of color and other people who have not traditionally belonged to.
Yeah, but that's just anecdotal.
Yeah. Thanks, Jana. Yeah. So, the one mode of storytelling that scientists are actually extremely comfortable with is teaching. And so scientists tend to approach every story as if it were a classroom. I'm going to pick on somebody here. I'm going to pick on Juan Maldacena. Does anyone know Juan Maldacena? No, because it's physics and it's deep physics. Okay, so there's this amazing idea in contemporary physics called holography. It doesn't have anything to do with like the little bird on your credit card. It has to do with changing dimensions. It takes a problem in gravitational physics and translates it like a dictionary. It's a dictionary that translates a problem in gravitational physics into a problem about particles, fields, and information. Now, both of these fields are really hard. They have two completely separate languages, but having this dictionary means I can take this problem and translate it into this language and use a brand new set of tools to attack it. And this is why suddenly everyone who's modeling quantum critical devices at sub-zero temperatures is talking about black holes. You know, this is our big breakthrough in understanding complex quantum materials at sub-zero temperatures. They come from people who are like, we could use the black hole math and tools here. And you're like, you can? You can. Why can you? Because this guy invented it, Juan Maldacena. So famous within the holography community that at the Strings conference, Strings is the big conference, right? The 300 physicists in a room, and I need you to close your eyes and imagine them in 1999 doing the Maldacena, which is, of course, a variation on the Macarena. I have been unable to find tape of this, but I have collected several witnesses. I'm sure that it exists. I saw him give a public lecture, and one of the reasons I feel comfortable picking on him is because he is a brilliant science communicator. I worked with string theorists for 5 years without figuring out just the basics of like, who are these people and what are they trying to do? Until I met him, and he sat me down for half an hour. And I'm like, oh, okay. Now I get it. He's patient, he's funny, he has interesting analogies, he's thought about how to present something, and here he's talking to the public about space-time. It's giving a public lecture.
Geometry is a very basic
He's about
notion.
2 minutes in.
It is
He's
possible
just
even
talked
to
about
find it in unexpected places. And
lines,
so I'm going to give you an example
planes,
of how we can find it even
your
in
basic
children's
geometry
games.
stuff, and he's about to take it further.
There is this game called Spotted that consists of, has many different cards with different images, and when you play you have to match an image that is in your card to the image that's been played, to the image in the card that's been played. And by the way, I'm not getting any ad money.
Thanks, Juan.
So, for example, these are the cards, and for example, you have these two different cards, and then you can find the image that is in common between these two cards. Can you find it?
Who can find it?
Yeah,
if we look
there
at that
it is.
card and that card,
So, for example, between these two other cards, there is also
if we
an
look
image in
at
common.
this card
Can you find it?
and this card,
Okay, good, good. You're getting good.
good for
Okay, so we're
you,
not
team.
going to continue. So what we see is that given any two cards, there is a unique image in common. Now, there is a kind of geometry behind this game. So I just said that given any two different cards, there is a unique image in common. And this sounds similar to that postulate of geometry if we replace the word cards by points and image by lines. So we can, from this little game and this little system of cards, we can abstract this notion of geometry. And in fact, so we define replacing the names in this way. There is a geometry behind this game. In fact, something called finite geometry, which is something that was developed in the 17th and 18th centuries.
All right. So, yeah.
Just point out that another example of a scientist who does this is Tom Lehrer, okay, who is a mathematician and a professor at UC Santa Cruz.
Yeah. So this is a good piece of science communication, right? Because this is like how you take the notion of geometry, it points to points and lines, and abstract it so that it can apply to anything. But his talk is to members of the general public, and it's not about that, it's about holography. But he's teaching. He's going to start from Euclid and build up to it, and he'll get to holography at about the 40-minute mark. Okay? By which point, no one, I mean, your brain will be completely full. Cognitive science tells us you can get about 3 points into a public lecture. Ideally, 1 point and 2 supporting points. which means if you're giving a lecture like this, you need to decide what that point is and lead with it. You need to walk out on the stage and say, the universe might be a hologram. I'm going to blow a soap bubble, right? Okay. The universe might be like the breath, the sphere of breath that's there, a bulk that's actually being projected inward and held together by a thin film on the outside that's something an entirely different kind of system. Right? We think this might literally be true. We know it's useful to pretend that it's true. Here's where I was standing the day this thought first came to me. Right? This is how you do a public lecture. Resist the urge to teach it. He teaches it. He's brilliant. He's so good. But he's teaching it. He's teaching it as if it were a class with no mathematics in it. Right? He's going to build up to it, starting from Euclid all the way through. And this is everybody's instinct, is to build up to it, starting with Euclid and go all the way through. But as science communicators, I urge you not to do this. Start at the end. Decide what you want to say and start there, right? I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I would do if I were, I teach this, but the good news is storytelling is not rocket science. It's not brain surgery. It is primal, it is human. Becoming a great storyteller is the work of a lifetime. Becoming an adequately good storyteller, you can do in a couple of days. I promise. It's not that complex. There are just a handful of kind of general points. But it is hard, because there are certain things you have to overcome. Let's do some experiential learning. Oh boy. The room is probably too noisy for me to break you up into pairs. Let's try it anyway. Can you guys break up into pairs or groups of 3? Or let's break up into table things. Let's break up into table lines. Scoot together so that you can hear each other, okay? All right. Okay, you can hear each other. The person on the aisle. Your job as the person on the aisle, the center aisle, is to come up in your head, please don't tell your partners what it is, with a song that you're certain they will know, something extremely common, maybe like Yankee Doodle Dandy, something, think of the tunes that everybody knows. Okay, not that one. All right, now turn to them. This is Yankee Doodle Dandy, right? And tap it out. My Yankee Doodle. Mm-hmm. All right, and see if you can convey enough information that your partners can decide what the song is. Go! You ready? No, just tap. Just tap. No, you can tap across. Do the thing. Give it a try. Yeah, see, do you know what the song is?
I think that I thought I knew when she started.
Mm-hmm. All right. And cut. Cut. All right, guys, I'm going to do the teacher thing. If you can hear my voice, clap once. If you can hear my voice, clap twice. I can get 6th graders to pay attention to me. So, tappers, who thought this was going to be yeah, okay, I can convey this? No, it was harder than you thought? People listening, could you get it? Yeah? You did? Who could get it? You got it? You got it? Wow, this is not how it goes when I do it with 6th graders. You're special. You're special. All right. The point of this exercise is that when we're telling a story, just as in we're trying to convey it in words, something that's already in our head, right? This in psychology is called the curse of knowledge. You can't unknow what you know. And therefore, it's really hard to turn to someone else and realize that they do not also have that song in their head. They do not also have that information in their head. So they're not hearing what you're hearing. When you're tapping on the table, you're hearing the song because, that's how you figure out when to tap. But your partner can't hear it. What's your question?
More of a statement. This reminds me years ago when one of my colleagues gave me the book Flatland. Have you ever read that book? And sort of how people, and the concepts that they talked about in Flatland, being presented with something that's beyond anything you've ever seen, and how you come about trying to understand that.
Yeah, like you can't perspective taking. Storytelling is basically perspective taking, and people's perspectives vary. And in this particular context, people's perspectives vary pretty radically. Even when scientists are actively trying to compensate for it, we tend to overestimate how much stuff people know. Like, was anybody in the lab tour? I really enjoyed the scattering lab and their images of the red blood cell. But they start their talk with something like, "This is not your grandpa's Raman scattering," and I'm like, oh shoot. My grandpa was a farmer. I mean, it took me, I took a physics degree, but it was literally in another century, and I haven't used it since. That is gone, right? Even when acronyms get tossed around the room, like we had AGI yesterday. I've heard the phrase artificial general intelligence, but not often enough that AGI instantly conveys that to me, right? You're in a room full of folks who have various expertise. They're all smart, but they don't have your expertise, and you need to compensate for this hard, okay? You need to make a list of all the things you think that they know. And then you need to resist the temptation to give them an overview of your field, okay? You're not teaching. You are taking them on a walk through your field. And they're not even students. They don't need to be able to find their own way back, okay? We're just going to take them for a walk. We're going to make them feel confident, like they're not getting lost. That'll be good. And they're going to see a couple of amazing things on the way. Are they going to see the whole field? No. So just decide on your path and limit your focus. The other thing to do, this is the middle one, meet your audience where they are. And this is the point of this cartoon, right? Your audience knows less than you think they do. It's so hard, the curse of knowledge, to unknow what you do every day. You need to be more generous than you think you need to be. Generous is a good way to think about it. You need to put more blazes on the path, right? More handholds on the rock face than you think you might need. Yeah.
So when I'm meeting with students, I'm perfectly capable of teaching the field.
Yeah.
But what the students really like is when I tell stories.
Yes.
Just point it out.
They do. They do, because that engages them with something that they can instantly do. Their brains have been hardwired to do it for thousands of years. And this is the last big point about storytelling. Storytelling is essentially emotional. Did you know that there's a kind of brain damage you can get where you lose access to your emotions? When you get this kind of brain damage, you also lose your ability to make decisions. Because emotions are shortcuts for decision making and understanding. Even very simple decisions, like what am I going to wear today? You know, if you don't have a gut feeling for it, if you can't rely on your emotions, then it's extremely hard to do. So the story you're telling, and you need to remind yourself, is not a story about generative AI. It's not a story about carbon sequestration. It's not a story about personalized genomic medicine. It's a story about struggle. It's a story about triumph. It's a story about wonder. It's a story, you need to identify the emotion and then build the story into that. I have a couple of specific tips for doing it, and I've got a couple of seconds left, so I will tell them to you if no one wants to interrupt me. All right. I got all the way to the end of my deck. They said it would never happen. Okay. 3 specific ways to get emotion into your story, because that's hard. That's not what we're trained to do. First of all, set a scene, okay? Make it physical and concrete. You may have noticed when we were in the labs yesterday that it's much easier to connect with things when you can physically see them than when they're being presented to you in the abstract. So the folks who've got robots to show us have got a much easier job. But if you don't have robots, then you need to set the scene. You need to say, I was standing at my computer, like there's this guy who's dating cave paintings. And he got the data back on the cave paintings, like to try to get the date on it. And he's like, I looked at it again. I picked up the phone and I called my funder. And I said, 35,000, right? So you need to set the scene, right? You need to, I hate the advice, show, don't tell. Show, don't tell specifically about emotions. So there are plenty of places where you want to show for the purposes of time. But show, don't tell specifically about emotions. So don't say, I was happy, because that does not connect to your audience. Say something like, you know, I sprang up out of my chair, or all the blood seemed to rush out of my feet, or I couldn't even get the words out. Specifically, when you want to be emotional, describe, don't use the emotion word. And my last tip, because I am out of time, is to include dialogue or gestures, right? Nothing makes something sound more concrete than actually quoting dialogue. And I'll give you one example before I go. Remember way back with the China syndrome, how those stories snapped together? They did a lot of man-on-the-street interviews. And the one that convinced me that these things were just completely conflated, they talked to a police officer named Brian McKay. They said, Officer McKay, are you going to go see this movie? He's like, well, I didn't figure I had to. I just lived through it. Right? Exact dialogue, exact gestures will bring you right into the scene. I know this is hard. This is a bigger problem than we can possibly tackle. Whether or not scientists are being listened to, whether or not scientists have trust, but this is our first step. We need to get better at telling stories so that we can join this conversation on equal terms. So I hope I've convinced folks at least of the need, if not of the actual how-tos. And I really appreciate being your wild card here this morning.
I'd like to add just one thing for people who have been with this conference series for an extended period. I think Mike Hawley was the best ongoing storyteller that we had had in this community. Miss him dearly, and people who heard him speak think about him and how he conveyed things, and that would be a great model too.
Very much agree. And he and John Perry were the wordsmiths as my role models, I guess. So I guess my response to you, Erin, is I have a pit in my stomach from wishing I had heard your talk 40 years ago. Thank you. That was wonderful.